have Dr. Matt Buttler, and he's going to present on neuroscience of taste and smell. Dr. Matt is a registrar in psychiatry and clinical academic. He graduated with undergraduate, medical, and postgraduate research degrees from University of Manchester before moving to work at South London and Maudsley. He's a member of Royal College of Psychiatrists and currently based at the Institute of Psychiatry, Psychology and Neuroscience at King's College London, researching neuropsychiatric disorders and psychopharmacology. So we are very excited to hear your talk today, and the platform is all yours.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for the kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be here, and this is my first time doing this, so I'm excited too. So, as mentioned in the introduction, I'm a doctor. I'm a psychiatrist. I'm based in London in the UK. So my job is to be a doctor, but also to do research. And one of the key things that I've been researching alongside many of my colleagues recently is COVID-19, of course. And we know, and you may have heard in other talks, that of course COVID-19 affects the nervous system and the brain in many ways. And in one of the ways it does so is through affecting people's sense of taste and smell. And I know this quite well because I had COVID 18 months ago. I still have issues with my sense of smell. So this is sort of, sort of spurred me on to research, what COVID does to the brain, to the nervous system, but also the effects that it has on taste and smell. So I've been asked today to give a brief introductory talk about the neuroscience of taste and smell, and a bit about how that relates to the brain and the nervous system. So I thought I'd start with a very sort of general introduction, thinking about why do we have taste and smell in the first place. Of course, they are important special senses that we all have. We use them every single day, but I guess we don't stop every day to think about why do we have them in the first place. Well, I think we could probably split them into two kind of principal reasons. The first thing being that we have a sense of smell and taste to stop us from eating things that are dangerous or harmful to us. So we think about sewage. Sewage obviously stinks, it smells really badly. There's that adverse kind of disgust that we have towards that smell. And so it kind of, it's a method for us to sort of stay away from things that are dangerous to us. And we don't want to go near it. So that's obviously quite useful. And obviously, of course, the last thing you want to do is eat the thing that smells terrible. If we did so, we might get some germs in and, start to get quite unwell. But on the flip side, there's the positive aspects of taste and smell. And, we are drawn towards things that smell really nice. Walking past a restaurant, past a bakery, the sweet kind of smells, they remind us of the food that we need to survive. And particularly kind of sweet smells, smells of meats, things that, were kind of fundamental to our kind of existence. They smell nice. And, again, that's the sort of fundamental reason why we have these senses. It kind of draws us towards the things that we need and pushes us away from things that we don't need. So keeping those things in mind, let's have a little bit of a think about what happens when we smell. So I'll focus on our sense of smell initially, and then I'll talk a bit more about our sense of taste, and then I'll draw it all together. When we smell, it is in fact the molecules, the particles of whatever is around us in the environment that do get up our nose, as shown in this little video clip. And if we see the red little pieces of literally airborne particles that we inhale. So let's say there's a piece of meat on the side. When we're smelling that meat, the molecules from the meat are coming up in the air into our nose, and they're attaching themselves to what's called olfactory receptors. Now, olfactory is the term that we use for sense of smell. So whenever you see olfactory, you think smell. And receptor obviously means the end of a nerve that is ready to receive something to cause it to send a signal. And in our nose, we've got loads and loads of these olfactory receptors. A little bit more detail about what goes on. So in our noses, they're essentially a big cavity. There are what are called turbinates, which are pieces of bone and cartilage which make the air sort of spin around, around. So that means that when you breathe in things, they don't sort of hit you straight away, and you don't get things in your lungs like dust or other particles you don't want to. But essentially, the air that you're smelling gets right up into the back of your nose every time that you take a breath. And if you think of this as a cross section of someone's skull, so obviously the nose and the air going in, and that bone that you can see, the kind of creamy coloured bone, is a part of the skull called the cribriform plate, which is basically like a sponge, really, made of bone. Outside of this cribriform plate, sort of going through it like that, are the olfactory nerves, so the smelling nerves. And at the end of the smelling nerves are the olfactory receptors. And these receptors are embedded in a group of different types of cells called the olfactory epithelium, which are almost like the supporting cells for the nerves. So they're not the nerves themselves; they're the tissue that it sits in. And this is, if you remember the olfactory epithelium, this is important later when I discuss a bit about COVID-19. And so we see that the odour particles go up into the nose, and then they are sensed by the olfactory receptors. And they go to a large body of nerve called the olfactory bulb, which sits kind of on top of your nose, just where the brain kind of sits. So up there, if you can imagine, a kind of cross section of my own head. So when a smell particle goes into the nose and it binds to the olfactory receptors, they fire off and they send signals to the brain. I'll talk a bit more detail about that in a moment. But just to sort of zoom in a little bit more, so I mentioned the kind of olfactory epithelium. So these are the kind of supporting cells, these ones in blue. There are glands inside these epithelium. So glands being types of tissue that secrete things. So this secretes a kind of mucus. So when the particles go into the nose, they dissolve into this mucus, and that helps the cells able to recognize these smells. And just to zoom in, so the way I was taught about olfactory receptors, the way I like to think about them is almost like a lock and key. So if you think about the olfactory receptor, so this is the end of the nerve. It sits inside the olfactory epithelium, and when an odorant, so that's another name for the smell particle, comes into the nose, it sits inside the olfactory receptor. So the key being the odorant and the lock being the olfactory receptor. The odorant then unlocks the olfactory receptor, and then that sends the cell, the signal through the cell into the nerve and then into the brain. But it's important to remember that, so I think there's a lot of kind of talk about how humans are pretty poor at, with our sense of smell. Definitely true that we're visual creatures. Much of our kind of the way that we interpret our environment, the way we move around the world, is because of our sense of sight. In comparison to something like a mouse, for example, which uses the sense of smell much more to be able to sort of work out what's going on in its world. But actually, humans are pretty good still at smell, and there are over 1,000 genes for smell receptors in our DNA. So if you think about that, the number of combinations that can give, it means that we're actually pretty good at discerning between different smells. And what the research has shown is that we're quite good at saying that one smell is different to another one. What sometimes we're not quite good at is naming what the smells are, but that's not to say that we're not good at it. It just means we haven't got the language to describe it. So people like wine tasters, they have the same sense of smell as we all do, but what they get good at is being able to find words to describe what they're smelling. And as I've mentioned, so there are lots and lots of receptors inside the nose, and when the olfactory receptors get the signal, they kind of send signals off to the brain. And then what the brain does is it combines these signals into one, because of course many things that we smell across our environment, they're not just one thing, they're a combination of lots and lots of different smells. And it's the brain's job to then interpret what, put this all together and then decide what it means. this slide is quite complex, but some of you, I think there's a sort of range of sort of ages in this talk. So just if people are sort of biological whizzes, they may know about kind of receptor signaling. So just a very brief foray into this. So the binding causes ATP to be converted into cyclic AMP when a smell molecule binds, and that causes an influx of calcium predominantly, but also sodium, an efflux of chloride ions, and this leads to depolarization. And I heard sort of talk about this previously in the previous talk. So that this is what leads to the signaling from the cell. So that's the kind of molecular means by which the binding of the to the receptor that leads to the kind of neural signaling. Put this diagram in here just because I think we're all familiar with the sort of the notion that sometimes when we smell things, we could instantly be transported back to our childhoods or things that have happened to us in the past. And that's because the sense of smell almost has a direct kind of route inside to the very deep parts of the brain and into the areas that are involved in memory and emotion. So the olfactory bulb, which if you remember from the previous diagram is the bit that receives all the messages from the olfactory receptors initially, that projects straight into areas of the brain which are very deep down in the limbic cortex, and also very close to the hippocampus and the temporal lobes. So this is why sometimes we can feel very nostalgic or very happy or very sad when we smell something, because it goes straight into the deep parts of the brain that remind us of the smell that we smelled previously. And there's a part of the brain here labeled the thalamus, and usually so our vision, our hearing, lots of our other senses, our touch, go through the thalamus, and they're sort of pre-processed in the thalamus, and that kind of gives a delay, but also it means that these things are more kind of accessible to conscious thought, whereas smell goes straight into the kind of it's such an old it's one of the oldest senses that exists. All animals have senses, and so it goes very much into those deep parts, which is one of the reasons why biologically smells are so evocative of certain things, times past, evenings spent in restaurants, things like that. And one thing I would say, so I alluded to the fact that I lost my sense of smell with COVID. I'm sure many of you will know people who've had the same thing, and for some people it's persisting. Why might that be the case? Well, we know that people in certain diseases and injuries lose their sense of smell. So the kind of classic ones are a head injury. Now, if you remember, I told you the cribriform plate was a bit like a sponge. If someone has a force to their head, the force of that can cause the nerves to sort of be sliced off basically from the cribriform plate, which can cause kind of lasting problems with smelling. We also see a loss of smell in people who have things like dementia, so Alzheimer's, Parkinson's disease, and this is because of the nerves themselves are dying alongside other cells in the brain, which is part of the disease process of things like Alzheimer's. But also, of course, we see other things like COVID, and scientists are trying to work out why that's happening at the moment. We're not completely sure. It's probably the supporting cells that I previously mentioned, so the epithelial cells, which the COVID virus gets inside of, and then it's the body's own immune system which attacks these cells, which causes kind of collateral damage to the olfactory receptors and the olfactory nerves. That's probably what causes the problems in COVID, although we don't know. And what we do know, though, is that olfactory nerves can regenerate. So for most people, even if there is damage, a little bit of time passes, weeks, sometimes months, and the nerves can regenerate. But it's possible in some people, like me, for example, there is a sort of scar tissue from, lots of immune attacking to these olfactory supporting cells. And this might take a bit more time to sort of get over than most people with COVID. But as I say, we're early days. We don't quite know exactly what's going on there. So don't take your sense of smell for granted. I'll talk now quickly about our sense of taste. But when I was taught in biology in high school, I was shown this tongue map, which is supposed to sort of indicate the bits of the tongue which are responsible for sensing different types of taste, so bitter, sour, sweet, and salty. Now, I think if you're going to take one thing away from this talk, it's this, and that is completely wrong. In fact, all of the tongue is able to sense all of the tastes. So actually the 5 principal tastes, being bitter, sour, sweet, salty, and something called umami, which is the newer kind of taste, which is kind of like the nice, meaty, sort of flavoursome taste that you get from some dishes. But so that actually all I'll come on about the receptors, but they're all over the tongue. They're not specific bits of the tongue that are, you know, specified with certain parts of the taste. A slightly complex figure, but just to say that, you know, if you look at your tongue, if you stick it out, we've all got lots of little bumps, and these are called papillae. And these are inside these bumps are where the taste buds live. And there's not one taste bud per bump. There's actually quite a lot, but these are they're almost the domes where the little taste buds sit. And these taste buds, there are different sorts. They respond to different flavors when you eat things. And this is a little bit of a kind of cartoonish diagram of what the taste buds look like. It works a really similar principle actually to the smell receptors, in the sense that you need to have little particles that bind to the receptors at the top here. So where there's the gap right at the top, that's where perhaps the sugar or the salt, sodium chloride, would go inside. And if it's the right fit, if it's the right key for the lock, if it fits in, then you'll get the signaling, and then it'll be telling you that there's the right molecule, or, you know, that thing is sweet or that thing is bitter. And again, these are kind of amalgamated from the tongue and then go inside the brain. And I'll talk about that in a moment. Again, quite a complex slide as previously, but just to say it's a similar process. You see the molecules binding, which leads to kind of depolarization via ion influx, depolarization of the nerves, and neurotransmitter release, which then transmits the nerves to the gustatory cortex. And as olfactory is the kind of medical term or scientific term for smell, gustatory is the medical or scientific term for taste. I think I've kind of talked about these 2 points mostly, but just to say that actually what we know for certain is that taste is much more than just what our tongue is sensing. You know, it's actually quite a combination of the 2 things that our brains put together. The temperature of the food, and there are temperature sensing nerves, temperature receptors, just as we have in our skin, that, you know, tell us whether it's hot or cold outside. They're also the same ones that do food. Texture, so there are what's called mechanoreceptors in the tongue and in the mouth, and also in the epiglottis, which give us a sense of how hard or smooth or firm the food is. It's got spiciness. You know, I'm talking from people from India, you know, much better than I do about spicy food, but I love spicy food. That's a different thing. You know, that's actually through pain receptor. So it's actually kind of mimicking pain. I mean, it's a pleasurable experience for me. I love eating spicy food. Some people don't, but it is through pain receptors. We kind of become accustomed to the fact that it's not harmful. And finally, but actually probably the most importantly, taste is actually, a lot of it is smell. Particularly the smell particles can go kind of the backwards route when you eat something, so they can go into your mouth and sort of back up this way into the smell sensing nerves in the nose, and actually probably, you know, 80 to 90% of what food tastes like comes from that route. So it's more about your smell. We get the basic idea, whether it's bitter, sour, salty, or sweet, from the tongue. A lot of it comes from the kind of extra stuff like the smell. And just to show you a quick diagram, I mentioned the olfactory cortex, that's the one in yellow, very deep down in the brain, indicates that it's from an evolutionary old period. It's an old kind of sense. It's the same thing, perhaps slightly less so, but it's the same thing with taste. The gustatory cortex lying right at the bottom of the parietal lobe. You know, it's a very kind of evolutionary old part of the brain, which again indicates it's a kind of fundamental sense for animals, not just humans. If you contrast that to something like the visual cortex, which you will know by now, lies right at the back of the brain, the occipital cortex, that's, you know, a slightly sort of evolutionary newer phenomenon. And I would say, don't take your sense of taste for granted either, because many people will find that as they get older, partly because they lack saliva production when they get older, so our salivary glands don't work as well. The saliva, as the kind of mucus in the nose does, the saliva helps to kind of let the taste molecules kind of dissolve in the tongue and into the taste buds. So that's one of the reasons why our sense of taste gets a bit dulled when we get older, but also because of probably a bit of damage to the tongue too. I realise I've gone slightly over time, apologies for that, but just to say in conclusion, both taste and smell are fundamental, vital senses which, you know, humans, but also all animals really need to survive. They both work by chemoreception, so that's the receptor molecules in the nose or the mouth sensing the molecule and then sending signals. And then these signals get passed to the kind of evolutionary quite old parts of the brain, and it's in the brain's processing which gives us that sensory experience of a delicious taste or smell. So that's the end of my whistle stop tour. I hope you enjoyed it.